A few days ago, Daniel Mesa, our Associate Marketing Director for Secrets Unsealed, found a short 5-minute video clip on the Lightbearers website. This clip deals with what is known as the third option. And in this presentation, I would like to respond point by point to each one of the aspects that are mentioned in this short clip. So let's turn our attention to the screen.
Is it right or wrong?
¿Es correcto o equivocado para nuestra iglesia ordenar mujeres? Puede que la respuesta es ninguna o las dos. Depende de dónde y cuándo vives. Dejadme explicar eso. Dios usa la Biblia para compartir a su pueblo cómo deberían vivir sus vidas. Alguna vez, Dios ayuda a la gente a saber cómo vivir dándoles leyes eternas que nunca cambian con la época o la cultura. Cosas como siempre honra a Dios, amaos unos a otros, guardad mis 10 mandamientos. A esto llamamos leyes morales y estos nunca cambian. Otras veces Dios da consejos a su pueblo sobre cómo organizarse en la cultura y época de sus días. Esas directrices son fundamentales y prácticos, pero no se aplican siempre para las personas de cada cultura y época de la historia de la tierra. Por ejemplo, saludaos unos a otros con un beso santo puede no estar bien visto en tu iglesia local.
Is it really legitimate to compare the holy kiss with leadership roles in the church? Actually, the holy kiss has nothing to do with church organization or with the cultus. Further, Paul does not command everyone to greet one another with a holy kiss. Some nations still use the holy kiss. Just go to Cuba and Argentina and you will see. The holy kiss obviously is a practice that varies from culture to culture. But the principle of expressing brotherly love is universal and timeless. There is no evidence whatsoever that God has ever varied his organizational ideal of male headship in the church and female submission to male leadership.
Algunas de las directrices que Dios da a su pueblo los ayuda a funcionar y continuar su misión en sus culturas. Todavía podemos encontrar principios que conectan la cultura bíblica y moderna, pero intentar y emplear literalmente los ideales organizativos hoy puede no funcionar muy bien. Esto está bien, y la Biblia incluso revela que Dios trabaja con su pueblo en circunstancias especiales en que individuos luchan para hacer todas las piezas encajar.
Do God's people really organize themselves according to their culture? Are God's specifications mere ideals and guidelines that each generation and culture can vary or bend? Ellen White begs to differ. This is what she states.
¿Ha dejado Dios de ser un Dios de orden? No. Él es el mismo en la dispensación actual como en la anterior. Pablo dice, Dios no es hacedor de confusión, sino de paz. Él es tan específico hoy como entonces. Y Él establece que deberíamos aprender lecciones de orden y organización del orden perfecto instituido en los días de Moisés para el beneficio de los hijos de Israel.
There is not a single example in Scripture where God's plan allowed for the ordination of women as leaders in Israel or in the church. In both Old and New Testaments, it was common in the surrounding cultures to have female religious leadership. Why do we not find even one example of Israel or the church caving to the pressures of culture? Why did Israel and the church remain countercultural when it came to spiritual leadership? It is said that applying organizational ideals may not work too well today. So the question is man's adaptation better than the divine ideal? Does man's plan B work better than God's plan A? Let's go to the screen.
Dios quiere estar seguro que esa propiedad puede pasar de generación en generación. Así que una regla establecida en Deuteronomio 21 dice que la herencia debe pasar a los hijos de un hombre. Un gran consejo que, sin embargo, evitó muchas disputas familiares. Pero en número 27 encontramos la historia de las hijas de Zelofejad. Esas chicas eran los únicos niños en la familia. Así que cuando el padre murió y no había hijos para tomar la herencia, las hijas serán amenazadas perder la herencia y la ayuda financiera. Moisés reconoció que el consejo respecto a distribución de la herencia a través de los hijos claramente no funcionaba muy bien en esta situación. Así que Moisés trae el asunto delante de Dios y Dios permite que las hijas tengan la herencia de su padre.
Does the story of the daughters of Zelophehad really have anything to do with leadership structures in Israel? This actually was a personal request over property inheritance, not about spiritual leadership in Israel. Was this expansion of the inheritance laws applied regionally according to culture? Of course not. After the daughters got married, the property continued to be passed down through the husband's side. Furthermore, God specified that the property still needed to remain within the tribe of Manasseh. It's interesting to notice that Moses brought it before the Lord and received direct divine instruction to expand the already existing inheritance law. Moses did not overrule the earlier law or go to a plan B. God simply expanded plan A. Neither Moses nor the people provided the expansion, but rather the Lord directly provided for the expansion by revelation. There is no evidence that this arrangement proved detrimental to the future history of Israel. The inheritance laws continued to be applied in the way in which God gave them to Moses, by divine revelation. Actually, giving the inheritance to women was not a novel idea, because we know that several centuries earlier, the daughters of Job were given an inheritance by their father. And I quote,
Y en toda la tierra no había mujeres tan hermosas como las hijas de Job. Y su padre les dio herencia entre sus hermanos.
And so there was a precedent to what happened with the daughters of Zelophehad. Now let's turn to our next video clip.
Otro ejemplo se encuentra en la historia de Israel eligiendo un rey. La Biblia dejó claro que el plan original de Dios para su pueblo fue que no tengan un rey, sino que obedezcan directamente de Dios a través de sus profetas. Sin embargo, después de llegar a la tierra prometida, ellos finalmente decidieron que quieren un rey. Sabemos que, aunque no fue el plan original de Dios, la mayoría de los relatos del Antiguo Testamento demuestran que Dios permitió el cambio del ideal y actuó a través de muchos grandes reyes para bendecir a su pueblo.
I'd like to read a statement from the document that was presented to the Theology of Ordination Study Committee by Nicholas Miller and David Trim, where the issue of the King of Israel is explained. And I quote,
Esta historia del rey es instructiva en varios puntos. Primero, demuestra que Dios está de acuerdo variar su ideal organizativo para acomodarse a circunstancias culturales y al deseo de su pueblo, aun cuando esos deseos causan el rechazo de Dios y de su voluntad por parte del pueblo en un asunto específico.
This statement sounds pretty incredible. The question is it true that the Ten Commandments are not involved in this decision, and that this is an organizational issue, and that God was willing to bend and allow them to change His organizational ideal to a plan B? In 1 Corinthians 10, verse 11, the Apostle Paul tells us that the history of Israel was meant for our instruction, especially for those who live in the last days of Earth's history. This is how he expressed it.
Y todas estas cosas les acontecieron como ejemplo, y están escritas para amonestarnos a nosotros sobre quienes ha venido el fin del mundo.
Isn't the beginning God's ideal plan? At this stage of human history, should God's church be implementing a less than ideal plan B, which did not work in the history of Israel? Would anyone suggest that the rejection of God as king was not an absolute moral issue? What the third option does not tell us are the consequences that came as a result of Israel's decision. Their decision was truly a cultural decision. They wanted to be like the other nations. And what was the result of their decision? Their kings married women from other nations and worshiped the gods of those nations. They made images of those gods. And to use a good King James expression, they went a-whoring after them. Instead of better fulfilling their mission, they lost sight of it. Instead of Israel being united, it divided into two kingdoms. Instead of leading to greater freedom, it led to the Assyrian and Babylonian captivities. Was this not a violation of the first, second, and seventh commandments? If it was, then this is a moral issue. This danger began even with the wisest men on earth, Solomon. He formed alliances with the kings of the nations, married their daughters, and his heart was turned away from the Lord. And this was a direct result of establishing a theocracy independent of God. Ellen White expresses it this way. But when a man placed upon the
Pero cuando un hombre fue puesto en el trono, él tendió a apartar de Dios las mentes del pueblo. Ellos confiaron más en el poder humano y menos en el poder divino. Y los errores de su rey les condujeron en el pecado y a la división de la nación de Dios.
Ellen White further explains,
El Señor, a través de sus profetas, había anunciado que Israel sería regido por un rey. Pero esto no significa que esta forma de gobierno era la mejor para ellos o de acuerdo a la voluntad de Dios. Él permitió al pueblo seguir su propia elección porque se negaron a ser guiados por su consejo. Oseas declara que Dios les dio un rey en su ira. Oseas 13:11. Cuando los hombres optan por tener su propio camino sin buscar el consejo de Dios o en oposición con su voluntad revelada, Él a menudo les concede sus deseos para que a través de la amarga experiencia que sigue, puedan ser llevados a comprender su necedad y a arrepentirse de su pecado. El orgullo y la sabiduría humana son un peligroso guía. Lo que el corazón desea en contra de la voluntad de Dios, al final se mostrará a ser una maldición antes que una bendición.
and then Ellen White continues, and everybody should read the entire chapter about Israel wanting a king. She begins by saying, like all the nations,
Como todas las naciones,
Israelites did not
los israelitas no entendieron que ser distintos de otras naciones en este aspecto era un privilegio y una bendición especial.
God had separated the Israelites
Dios había separado a los hijos de Israel de todos los demás pueblos para hacerlos su propio tesoro peculiar. Pero ellos, despreciando este alto honor, anhelaban con avidez imitar el ejemplo de los paganos. Y todavía el anhelo de ajustarse a las prácticas y costumbres mundanas, cultura, existe entre los que profesan ser el pueblo de Dios. A medida que se apartan del Señor, ellos se vuelven ambiciosos para conseguir ganancias y honores del mundo. Los cristianos están constantemente tratando de imitar las prácticas de los que adoran al Dios de este mundo. Muchos insisten en que, uniéndose con los mundanos y conformarse a sus costumbres, ellos podrán ejercer una influencia más fuerte sobre los impíos. Pero todos los que seguirán esta línea se separarán de la fuente de su fuerza. Volviéndose amigos del mundo, ellos son los enemigos de Dios. En aras de méritos terrenales, ellos sacrifican el honor indescriptible al que Dios les ha llamado para mostrar claramente las virtudes de aquel que nos ha llamado de las tinieblas a su luz admirable. Hay muchos más ejemplos de que Dios permitió cambios en sus estándares, como el de permitir a la mujer Débora juzgar y liderar a Israel.
So what about the leadership of Deborah? For those who are interested, I wrote a long article for one of our Secrets Unsealed newsletters that you can acquire by going to our website, secretsunsealed.org. I just want to make some very important points. First of all, this event of Deborah's leadership took place during a very chaotic period in the history of Israel. It was between the Hebrew monarchy and the conquest of the land. This period is not the organizational ideal for God's people. Furthermore, Ellen White says that Deborah stepped to the plate because of the absence of the usual magistrates. Furthermore, I ask the question, did Israel from that point on elect women judges regionally according to culture or the desires of Israel? There is no evidence whatsoever that any other women served as judges after this. Furthermore, we're told that Deborah judged private and civil cases under a tree. definitely an interesting place for a courtroom. Furthermore, we clearly get from the story that the Barak was the central figure. It was Barak that summoned the troops. It was Barak that led the troops. It was Barak that pursued the enemy. It's interesting to notice that Samuel later referred to this episode of history, and he mentions Barak as the central figure and not Deborah. She did not deliver Israel. In fact, the story says that it was a woman called Jael who delivered Israel. In Hebrews, when the heroes of faith are mentioned, it is Barak who is mentioned in the story as the hero, and Deborah is not mentioned. Does this mean that Deborah was a non-important figure? Of course not. Deborah was very important. She fulfilled a very important mission. But the fact that this was an exceptional case does not mean that women should be elected as judges on a regional basis according to the exigencies of culture at any given time.
O el de permitir a David comer el pan sagrado.
Actually, David's eating the showbread had nothing to do with organizational matters in Israel. The question is, was the eating or not eating of the showbread a matter of cultural exigencies, or was it rather a personal matter? Would people in some regions be allowed to eat it as long as they felt it was all right, while others could abstain because they thought that it was wrong? Did the exception later become the rule in all of Israel? Was it now left to the people to decide when exceptions were to be made? The fact is that eating the showbread had nothing to do with keeping Israel united or fulfilling their mission. It was a personal matter, and there is no other reference to anyone else ever eating the showbread other than the priests. It did not become a regional decision who could eat it and who could not. Jesus clearly said that what David did was not lawful. What did this decision of David's lead to? It led to the decapitation of the high priest, the wiping out of the entire priesthood, 85 priests, the death of every inhabitant of the city of Nob, and the demolishment of an entire city. Ellen White comments about the decision of David. She says this:
Aquí él manifestó falta de fe en Dios, y su pecado causó la muerte del sumo sacerdote. Si le hubiera manifestado claramente los hechos tales como eran, Ahimelech habría sabido qué conducta seguir para proteger su vida. Dios requiere que la verdad distinga siempre a su pueblo, aun en los mayores peligros. David le pidió al sacerdote 5 panes. El hombre de Dios no tenía más que pan sagrado. Pero David consiguió eliminar sus escrúpulos y obtuvo el pan para satisfacer su hambre.
Now let's go to our next video clip.
O como Dios permitió a David ser rey, aun teniendo moabitas entre sus antepasados.
God had said in Deuteronomy 23 and verse 3, and I quote, "An Ammonite
No entrará amonita ni moabita en la congregación de Jehová,
even to the 10th generation."
hasta la 10ª generación no entrará en la congregación de Jehová para siempre.
Now the question is, did God break his own rules when he chose Ruth, the Moabitess, to be one of the progenitors of the Messiah? If there were not 10 generations, did God know that he would have to go back on his word? The fact is that there were 10 generations between when God spoke these words and the days of Ruth. In that case, this was not an exception. There were 10 individuals between when this prophecy was given and the times of Ruth. Their names are Perez, Hezron, Ram, Aminadab, Nahshon, Salmon, Boaz, Obed, Jesse, and David. Further, even if there were not 10 generations, it is irrelevant. Because when Ruth severed her ties with her land, her family and her friends, and her gods, she was no longer a Moabite in the sight of God. In fact, Ruth 1, verses 15 to 17, draws a clear contrast between Orpah and Ruth. We're told that Orpah went back to her people and to her gods, but Ruth chose a different people and a different God. Would anyone dare say that God made an exception with Ruth? Now I read Ruth 1, 15 to 17.
Y Noemí le dijo a Ruth, mira, tu cuñada se ha vuelto a su pueblo, esos serán los moabitas, y a sus dioses, eso era el paganismo. Y luego Noemí le dice a Ruth, vuélvete tras tu cuñada. Y Ruth respondió, no me ruegues que te deje y que me vuelvo de seguirte, porque a donde quiera que tú vayas, iré yo, y donde quiera que vivas, viviré. Tu pueblo, eso será Israel, será mi pueblo, y tu Dios, eso era el Dios de Israel, será mi Dios. Así que está bien o equivocado ordenar mujeres. Puede que ninguna de estas opciones. La Biblia parece presentar la idea de liderazgo en la iglesia, pero lo hace de tal forma que lo hace parecer una norma organizativa que la iglesia puede ajustar para continuar con la misión del Evangelio, así como Jesús aprobó que David coma el pan sagrado, o como Dios ajustó su plan para permitir reyes y luego usar eso como un modelo para el liderazgo de Mesías.
Is it true that Scripture merely seems to present the idea of male leadership in the church? Is it true that male leadership is simply an organizational matter that can be adjusted by the church? Not according to 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, and Titus 1, 5 through 9, where we are told that elders and bishops must be the husbands of one wife. Now, what the video doesn't say speaks volumes. Is there any evidence that God allowed His people to adjust His organizational ideal in the Old and New Testaments? The stories of individuals such as Gideon, Nadab and Abihu, Uzziah, Jeroboam, Cain, Korah, Saul, and Uzzah clearly show that God is not willing to vary the cultus or the organization in Israel. It bears mentioning that none of these examples that I've provided have anything to do directly with the Ten Commandments, but rather with cultic and organizational regulations. And yet God allowed no exceptions to the rule in their cases. Is male leadership an idea that the Scripture seems to present? Absolutely not. Let me go through what Scripture teaches. Adam was the leader in the Garden of Eden. After sin, the firstborn male became the leader. The Levites were all males. The priests in Israel were all males. The 70 that Moses chose were all males. The heads of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens were all males. All of the kings of Israel were males, except for the usurper, Athaliah. All of the apostles that Jesus chose were males. The 70 that Jesus chose to help in His mission were all males. The successor for Judas was a male, chosen from among a larger group of males. Deacons were all males. Paul and Barnabas were both males. Elders and overseers were to be husbands of one wife. During the entire history of the Christian church, until the feminist movement of the late 19th century, only males occupied these positions in the church. During the lifetime of Ellen White, only males were ordained. Are there any exceptions that would allow women to be ordained to any of these positions? Absolutely not. If we introduce a new plan now, we are acting contrary to the overwhelming scriptural evidence.
Y probablemente esta es la llave para mantener unida a nuestra iglesia en este asunto. Mientras consideramos el asunto de la ordenación de mujeres como un asunto moral, será un muro en contra de la unidad de las dos partes en el debate. Pero cuando comprendemos que este es un ideal operacional que debería ser respetado, pero podría ser adaptado dependiendo de las circunstancias locales, los muros caerán y permitirán que la discusión sea centrada en cómo cada iglesia local puede afectar la cultura alrededor de ella. De este modo, a las iglesias se les permitirá decidir si en sus circunstancias la ordenación de mujeres para el liderazgo es importante para compartir el Evangelio. Si eso puede ser útil en sus zonas, debería permitirse este cambio, concordando con los principios bíblicos para cumplir la misión de Cristo en la tierra. Sin embargo, si otras iglesias creen que la guía bíblica sobre el liderazgo masculino será lo mejor para ellos en compartir el Evangelio, también se le debería permitir hacer lo que consideran mejor para alcanzar las almas por Cristo. El tema es más sobre cómo compartir el Evangelio y menos sobre todo lo demás.
This solution causes more problems than what it solves. The recommendation's obvious outcome would be that any reason will be considered a legitimate one. And when any reason is legitimate, it ceases to be an exception. Assurances that the church will continue to teach God's pattern of male leadership will be meaningless if the recommendation of the third option is adopted. World divisions that believe women should be ordained as ministers will not get a moment's recognition to a male leadership pattern. Every division will simply teach their own official position. The current disunity will be institutionalized, and confidence in the Bible will be weakened. Let's go now to our next video clip.
Puede que no estemos de acuerdo en cómo nuestros hermanos y hermanas en otras partes del mundo aplican correctamente las indicaciones bíblicas, pero si esto es un asunto de organización y no uno de salvación o un mandamiento absolutamente moral, deberíamos respetarnos unos a otros y dar a los demás la libertad de seguir las Escrituras según su convicción.
This video clip seems to leave the impression that adopting a plan B of ordaining women as elders and pastors is biblical, and the idea of ordaining only males as elders and pastors is also biblical, depending on the region of the world where it takes place. The question is, would God allow the church to adopt a plan B in San Antonio? Of course He would, just like He allowed Israel to adopt a plan B in electing a king. But does this mean that plan B would be the best for the future of the church? The history of Israel proves that it would not. Why would we want to adopt a plan B when we can adopt a plan A? Are we saying that God's plan A cannot keep the church united and lead it to fulfill its mission? So we must allow the church to adopt its own plan in order to keep the unity of the church and fulfill our mission? Are we saying that in certain regions God's plan A does not work as well as plan B? If God's ideal is male leadership, as option number 3 has stated, why not follow the ideal? Did not Jesus encourage us to go back to God's ideal at the beginning? This late in history, do we need a plan B to finish the work? I'd like to end by reading a statement from Ellen White that we find in Christian Temperance and Bible Hygiene, pages 42 and 43. Here she's talking about those who pray so that God will bend to do what they want God to do instead of the other way around. This is how she expresses it.
Aunque confrontados con las más claras órdenes de Dios, habrá hombres y mujeres que seguirán sus propias inclinaciones y luego se atreverán a orar sobre el asunto, pidiéndole a Dios que les permita continuar en la dirección contraria a su expresa voluntad. Satanás se acerca a tales personas tal como hizo con Eva en el Edén y los impresiona. Ellos experimentan emociones mentales y declaran esto como ser una muy maravillosa experiencia que Dios les dio. Pero una experiencia verdadera estará en armonía con las leyes naturales y divinas. La experiencia falsa se eleva a sí misma en contra de las leyes de la vida y de los preceptos de Jehová.
I trust that we will follow what God says in His holy word and not allow our own personal experiences, culture, or whatever it may be to lead us to make the wrong decision in this regard.